Welcome to Conversations Aloud. Today, we are taking you back in time to Palestine in the early 20th century. We're going to discuss how people connected to the land, the rise of Zionism, and the role of British rule in shaping the conflict that we see today. We're joined by Dixiane Halaj, who has written many books on Palestine. Her work draws from her lived experience in Palestine and Jordan and her personal connection to the region through her late husband, Mohammed Halaj, a Palestinian scholar and activist. Dixiane recently brought his work back to life in the latest book, Unfolding the Arab-Israeli Conflict, 1894 to 1970. Welcome to the show, Dixiane.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good to have you on. So let's start off with your first experience. When did you first visit Palestine, and how was that experience?
We went there to live in 1970, just days before Black September. We went in July
Was that in West
of
Bank?
19. We went to Jordan in 1970, and then Mohammed was teaching at the University of Jordan, and then he got a position at Pier 8 on the occupied territories, and that's when we moved to the Ramallah area.
Ramallah, yeah. Ramallah is beautiful. I've been there.
And the West Bank, yes.
Yeah, that's the northwest bank. Awesome. So I guess, I'm sure you've heard a lot, maybe you didn't before, about kind of the Palestinian kind of journey. When you went to Ramallah, was that experience as you expected? Was there war happening at that time in 1970 over there? How was the situation?
When we landed in Amman, there was a full-fledged civil war in September.
In Amman?
And in Amman, yes, Black September, it was called. And it was because there were so many Palestinian refugees and they weren't being served by the Jordanian government. And so the PLO, which was just beginning to have some strength behind it, had set up clinics and things, services for the refugees. And this was sort of usurping some of the power that should belong to the states. At any rate, it did cause a full-blown with tanks and heavy artillery. And it was scary. Yeah. But I surprised myself by not feeling that bad. I was surrounded by family. They took care of me.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't realize that that happened in Jordan, that there was a civil war there between the government and, from what you're saying, is the Palestinians that felt unserved. Because you're right, after there are many, you hear a lot, Arabs don't take the Palestinians, but after the war, most of the Palestinians after 1948 and after 1967 that fled went to the neighboring Arab countries, and there was a huge entry of those people. Like there's, I think, 2 million Palestinians that are in Jordan itself.
At least.
Yeah, so it's a big.
But they went to all the neighboring countries, and they lived in tents. They thought, give it a couple of weeks, the politicians will figure this out, and we'll go home.
Yeah.
Obviously, it didn't happen that way.
No, it didn't. So let's talk about the connection to the land, to Palestine. You spoke, I'm sure, to a lot of people there. You were surrounded by Palestinians. How do they view that connection to the land? I've always been interested in this because there's always, for a very long time, Palestine has been ruled by a larger force, whether it was, the Ottoman Empire, which ruled for 400 years until 1917, were then followed by the British rule for 30 years until the creation of Israel in 1948. How do people feel connected to that land and to Palestine?
You see, the Ottomans came in, and the Ottomans had they governed the land, but they didn't want to take the land for themselves. They just wanted what came from the land. They were ruling it. They weren't settling it. And the same with the British, except that the British allowed the Zionists to come in. So the people were connected to the land. The government was something nebulous except for the tax collectors. It didn't touch the ordinary person. Most of them were like subsistence farmers. Anyway, most of them that I knew about because, the Palestinians that were my family were that way. So they lived in the houses their fathers had built, or their grandfathers, or their great-grandfathers. You have to remember when in the Old Testament, when the Jews came out of Egypt, and they talked to the Philistines, which is the people they were fighting. Those were Palestinians. In Arabic, Palestine is Philistine.
Yep.
And so the Philistines were the people they were fighting when they invaded the first time. And these people have been there. There are people with the last names of Canaan. There are people that just, they've been there as far back as anyone can trace. The same families.
Oh.
And the land is what gives them their living, by and large. It was an agriculturally based society.
Which actually,
very,
now I'm thinking about it, so to interrupt, we all have connection to a land, but when it comes to, I guess, farmers, the connection is stronger because
yeah,
it gives you a lot of things. You are part of it. You're working on it day in, day
the
out.
land supports you.
Mm.
The land supports you and your family and your way of life.
Yeah.
And when I taught for a while at the University of Jordan, and you would ask a student, where are you from? And he would name a village in Palestine that he had never seen. His parents may not have seen. His grandparents may have come out in 48. And I say, how can they say they've been there? They're from there. They've never been there. Because in America, they don't. This isn't part of our culture. But it is. And when they came to the refugee camps, the people from one village tended to stay together because they were more comfortable with their neighbors they already knew. So they kept their little regional accent.
Mm.
And I remember talking to one woman, and she said, I don't remember the name of the village, but she says, I'm from this village. My tongue is from this village. Mm. People can tell where you're from sometimes, just regional accents, which every country has. And this is part of them. My husband's birth certificate says Qalqilia, but his mother was not physically in Qalqilia when he was born. But it says birthplace Qalqilia, Palestine. He was actually born in Ramleh.
Got it. So what did your late husband share with you about his childhood memories of Palestine? I mean, I saw he was born in 1937?
32.
32.
He shared his high school experiences, not his childhood, really. In high school, he would, in their classrooms, they nailed up blankets over the windows so that the blanket will be pushed if something comes before it doesn't go straight through because it's loose at the bottom. Mm. And so stray bullets might be caught by the blankets. There was fighting and all the time.
This was, in the 40s?
Yeah. The English were still there. And then they left and things just got worse. And they sent Qalqilia, which is my husband's hometown. The women gave their marriage gold. When a man and wife are married, they're gifted gold, and that is theirs. The woman, so if anything goes wrong, the husband gets sick or something, she has some insurance for her to live on for a while. They gave their marriage gold and sent a couple of men off to find weapons so they could defend themselves. They were farmers. They had orange groves, and they came back with these horrible World War I rifles that had been buried in the sand forever from the First World War, and ammunition that didn't actually fit the guns. And somehow they made some of them work, but that's what they had to defend themselves with. Mm. And, it was, they defended their city, their town. And then when the armistice came, they lost the land without even firing a shot.
Uh-huh.
The armistice line just, the people live in the village, but the land is all around the village. So they drew the line and they bumped it around the village and went down so that orange groves were gone.
This land became part of, Israel?
Yes. Because the original partition agreement gave Israel, I think it was 56% of Palestine, even though a little over 10% of the land was owned by Jews, and they were still very small minority in population even. And then, but by the time the armistice lines were drawn, they had 77% of the country.
Hmm. That's interesting. I didn't know that some villages were just kind of taken over just through the line without anyone actually fighting for them. I thought it was a
Well, they agree, okay, we'll stop fighting.
UK thing.
You give us this, we'll stop it right here. We won't go any further,
Mhm.
which they always agree and then have no intention of sticking to the agreement.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's take a step back and talk about Zionism a bit. How did Zionism evolve during this time? And how did the Palestinian society respond to it?
Well, Zionism really started in 1894, which is where the book starts, at the Dreyfus trial. Dreyfus was a captain in the French army, and he was wrongly accused of treason. And he happened to be Jewish. And one of the things they said is that the Jews are not loyal to France. They're loyal to their Jews, you know. And so Theodor Herzl was a reporter from Austria who was in France. He also was Jewish, but he was in France to cover this trial. And there was a whole crowd. I mean, this was like a media sensation, this trial. And so there was a whole crowd of people waiting outside the building to hear the verdict. Did they pronounce him guilty or not guilty? And when they came out and they said they pronounced him guilty, the whole crowd began to shout, kill the Jews, they're traitors, kill the Jews, death to the Jews. And this really traumatized Herzl. He thought, I'm not safe here. No Jew is safe among Gentiles. That was the idea it planted in his brain. And he became obsessed with that. And he worked toward that, convincing other people to follow him. And eventually he got Lord Rothschild to agree that having a place just for the Jews would be a good idea. And at this point, World War I was going on, because we've gone, backward in time here.
Yeah.
World War I was happening, and the Ottomans weren't doing so well. So Herzl went to the Sultan, of the ruler of the Ottoman Empire, and said, my buddy here, Lord Rothschild, will give you money. We will buy from you Palestine. Oh, and by the way, I have a lot of influence with the European press. We will also make sure you get, better reviews on the Armenia problem, because they were massacring Armenians at the time.
Yeah. So this was in what, 1917 or before?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a little before.
Okay.
And the Sultan had a little bit more moral fiber than people give him credit for. And he said, I'm sorry, Palestine, the land is not mine to sell. It belongs to its people. So this is the mindset that was there. The land belonged to the people belong to the land. Yeah, they owe their loyalty to the empire. They owe their tax dollars or whatever a tithing of their crops or what, but it was not his to sell. So then they started working on England, because by that time there was a secret agreement between Britain and France, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, that just said, okay, when this is over, here's the Middle East. We're going to draw a line here. Britain will take this, France will take that, and Russia will be fine because they take Armenia and all the stands. They'll be good. And this was secret.
Yeah. And just for the audience,
And
so to interrupt, just going on that line, they literally got a map and just drew a line and said the bottom is for the UK, the above is for France. And this was obviously, a secret agreement, because they made a deal also with the Arabs that they will have their own countries.
Exactly.
Publicly saying that, between them agreeing to separate everything.
Exactly. And, Lawrence of Arabia was out making that happen. They told the Arabs they can have their freedom. But in reality, what Britain really wanted, they needed to be right near the Suez Canal, because the Suez Canal was the gateway to India. India was the jewel in the crown of the British Empire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They needed the Suez Canal. And so it was their self-interest that made them take that on.
Interesting.
And then in November of 1917, now all this time since 1894, Herzl's been working up and convincing people Jewish people that they need a state, they need a place, they need to go there. And so in November, they had, okay, on one index card, nothing on the back, the Balfour Declaration. It is one sentence, a very long one. Can I read it?
Yes, please.
His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. That's the main clause. And then the part that's always forgotten, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. But that middle part kind of get lost. And that was the Balfour Declaration. And it was deliberately vague. What did they mean, a national home? You know, everybody that the Arabs said, okay, they can come and live here like everybody else. You know, at first, it wasn't a big deal. And then they started coming by shiploads and shiploads because World War II was there. And when it became clear, they said, okay, we need a national home. You were supposed to arm us. You were supposed to give us a nation, which was not what it said, but what the Zionists. And I need to make a distinction between Zionists and Jews. A Zionist are a subset, or Biden said he was a Zionist, so I guess Zionists aren't limited. But it's definitely, being anti-Zionist is not being anti-Semitic. And Arabs can't really be anti-Semitic since they're also a Semitic race.
Yep.
But everyone forgets that, which is okay. But
yeah,
using
it's interesting. So to your point, you know, when you look at the demographics, from what I've read, you know, in 1900, the Jewish population in that area was around 4 to 5% of the population. And suddenly, you know, when the Brits took over, which they controlled the borders, the immigration just ramped up, which was driven obviously by the anti-Semitism that was going on in Europe. And in fact, England didn't want Jews to come to England.
yes.
So they actually released the Aliens Act, targeting Jews not to come to the UK, and they wanted them to kind of move more towards Palestine. So, you know, from what I've read, 5% 1900, and by 1947 it was about 30%, 33%, and so in less than 50 years, huge immigration coming from Europe, which obviously caused a lot of problems.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much when it started to get very violent. And there were armed gangs. That's what they called them, the Stern Gang and I don't even remember the names of all of them, and the Haganah. And they were armed by the British. Sometimes, you know, gifted arms, and other times, they forgot to lock the armory door. You know, it just went out the back door. And they caused huge, you know, fear and terrorized the countryside. Of course, the most famous is the Deir Yassin massacre. And I don't think we need to go into details, but
yeah, a lot of massacres did happen, and there, from my understanding, also there were kind of, I think, attacks from both sides that occurred. There was violence that was erupting from kind of both sides, and once
the Arabs realized that the Jews were not going to just come and live peacefully with them, they became
yeah. And then, from what I understand, is actually when the Brits, when those organizations started to target the Brits, I've heard France started to support the Zionism movement against the Brits. You know, even though the Brits and the French have always been kind of together publicly, but privately they've always kind of worked against each other. And so from my understanding, is the French started to support the Zionist movement against the Brits, especially during the last few years. But I don't know if that's something that you've also seen in your research.
I don't know anything about that.
Mm.
But I do know that the Zionists were fighting the British as well, trying to get more out of it. And the British finally said, okay, we can't do this. And they went to the United Nations. Oddly enough, it started 1948 was the same year that India got its independence. So Britain didn't really need the Suez Canal anymore.
Mm.
And so they pulled out. They didn't have this burning interest in the region. And supposedly the mandate was to prepare the inhabitants of the land for self-government. That is what the UN charter that granted the mandate says. But there was none of that. They was just preparing it for the influx of Jews that they didn't want to come to their country.
Many supporters of Zionism argue that Jews have an unbreakable historical connection to the land, and they are merely reclaiming their ancestral homeland. How do you view that?
Well, like I said, the Palestinians were there first, even before Moses came out of Egypt. And also, was it really an unbroken thing? I mean, they were there for such a short time as conquerors. And the Romans were there, which sort of ended that, I think.
Yeah, 2,000 years ago.
And a lot of the Jews of today don't really have a blood connection with the Semitic Jews. I can't remember Sephardic and Ashkenazi. I can't remember which is which.
The Ashkenazi is the Jews that went to Europe.
Okay.
Yeah.
But Hebrew is a Semitic language, but Yiddish is not.
Okay, I didn't.
And Yiddish is a Germanic language, and there were demonstrations by the Jews that had come from Yemen and Egypt and places like that said, "Golda, teach us Yiddish," because they were getting nowhere.
Mm.
There's second-class citizens in Israel, but at least they're citizens.
Yeah. When was the last time you were in West Bank?
In the West Bank, I did the research for my doctoral program in 2004 in the camps.
Okay, so you were there.
I was interviewing illiterate women for my dissertation.
Oh, okay. And how was obviously 2004 is decades from 1948 and 1967. How was the mindset there of the people?
In what way?
In terms of how they view the West Bank, and I guess what they are hoping for that they can achieve in the future for a nation or for self-governance, in terms of especially the relationship with Israel, because it's a very difficult relationship to repair.
It gets harder and harder. Yes.
Yeah.
Differences and I hate to say hatred because that's not a good word, but they're become more and more severe. The injustice becomes more and more severe daily. But I think, this is my opinion, that a two-state solution is never going to work.
So what do you think will happen? I mean, is there any other option other than a two-state solution?
I don't know. It gets more and more distant all the time. But I think, the genocide is just, I think people say something like Israel is losing its soul, but I think they are. They're not abiding by the tenets of their own faith. And they're becoming what they most feared, during the Holocaust. They are doing the same things or worse. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I mean, there should be a Palestine where everyone can worship the way they want to. Worship has nothing to do with it. It's not a religious war. It's a war for land. You're taking my land, and that's what fed me. That's what kept me alive, my villagers alive, my people alive.
Mm. Yeah.
And I don't know how they're going to live side by side now, but I think that's the only way that there will be peace.
Yeah.
You can't you can't have something that walls everybody out.
Yeah. 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 I mean, peace is the only solution, and it is going to take time. But we've seen it happen before. Like with the Brits and Ireland, they were fighting each other, neighbors, killing each other, and now everything is great. There's a lot of Irish people that live here. There's a lot of Brits that live in Ireland, and they've kind of moved forward from those difficult days, and it's going to require, I feel like, a mindset
The
change.
future generations, I think.
Sorry?
I mean, it may require generations after what's just happened this last couple of year
Yes.
and a half.
The future, I feel like, is in the hand of the young, because they are able to make the change, and move away from the pain that maybe their parents have experienced
Yeah.
firsthand. The problem is that, a lot of people will say, 1948, 1967, such long times where people are not moving forward. The issue that I think a lot of people forget is that these things are happening today. When you go to the West Bank, for example, there's checkpoints.
Day.
Yeah, there's checkpoints everywhere. Everyone knows a member that's been killed, whether a family member or a friend.
Oh, yes.
The settlements are expanding. There's settler violence against, the Palestinians in West Bank. And, West Bank isn't ruled by Hamas. So, that doesn't exist
No.
there. So there's that. And obviously in Gaza, we all know what's happening there right now. What do you wish people in the West could truly understand on a human level about what life is like for the Palestinians that maybe they don't know about?
Well, I lived for 6 years under military occupation, and I taught at Birzeit University. And
And that's in the West Bank.
on the West Bank, yes. And it's a difficult existence because you have no control. You don't control your own life. At any time, the sound trucks can go through the town saying there's a curfew. And in this country, in the U.S., when people talk about curfew, they talk about dusk to dawn. And then you go about your business in the daylight. But there, it's 24/7. And don't even look out your window. Standing at a window is hazardous for your health.
Yeah.
And so everybody, every house has rice. Every house has dried beans. Every house has, lentils and powdered milk and ways to feed themselves if something closes abruptly. The trouble is when I'm at Birzeit teaching and they close the road and I can't get back to Ramallah where my kids are, that's a problem. And the soldier says, I'm just following orders.
Hmm.
And I said, yeah, they said that at the Nuremberg trials too. But they don't listen. And luckily, I had neighbors who took my kids in and fed them. It's unpredictable when there's going to be a curfew, when schools are going to close, when there's going to be, if the curfews last 5 or 6 days, they will say, okay, they'll bring the sound trucks around. I'd say 2 hours tomorrow, you can go out. And then in the early morning, they let the vegetable vendors go to where the checkpoint is and get their vegetables, and the meat vendors, so that they have something people can buy stuff. Anyway, that was in the 70s and 80s when we lived there.
It's really in your face. You can't escape it.
Yeah, it's in your face all the time. Soldiers would just show up at the gates of the university and say, we want so-and-so. And the university would say, we don't know where he is. They'd go around looking, poking. Sometimes they'd get nasty. They'd pull the guy out of the shower, out into the street. And this is a culture where nakedness is not a thing. You don't do that.
Yeah.
And somebody walking by gave him a jacket to or something to cover himself with. But, you know, who does that?
Mm. It's part of the plan to humiliate the population.
Yes,
Mm.
yes. I used to, when we lived on the West Bank, Mohammed's family was still in Jordan, and we would go. I would carry 8 passports in my purse. I would have I had 3 boys, and Mohammed had to use a different gate because he wasn't a U.S. citizen.
Mm.
He was a Jordanian citizen at the time. And so when we would get on the bus, because the only way you can go from one to the other is on the bus, we'd get on the bus, and halfway through, I would take I had a set that I used for traveling everywhere, my regular passport, and another set that I only used to get, had the Israeli stamps on it.
Mm.
Because if you had an Israeli stamp on your passport, the Arab governments wouldn't let you in their country
Yeah.
at that time. Today, it's very different.
Yeah, today I think I mean, when I went there, they don't stamp anything. They give you like a note, like a note instead of the stamp, because they know a lot
No.
of governments.
If you only go once, that's what they do. But since we
Oh.
lived there and we went multiple times during the passport period, they gave us a separate passport.
I see. Mm. It's hard to escape that. You know, when I went there, there was a lot of stories, and the issue is these stories come from young people where their friend died and they got shot in front of them, and which is hard to talk about peace when this happens to people. You have to have a lot of strength and kind of like some next level enlightenment to go beyond that, which is part of the reason why this is so difficult to move forward. What was it like to work on completing and publishing your late husband's work, that you just discussed, the unfolding the Arab-Israeli conflict? Did you get? Yeah.
I did get satisfied. I was going through his papers because I felt when the Gaza thing started to happen, and it just intensified instead of dying down, and I was just unfocused, and I wanted to do something that made me feel close to him. And so I was going through papers that I hadn't looked at, and I discovered or rediscovered, I knew it was there somewhere, but I hadn't thought about it in years. And it gave me a feeling that at least I'm doing something,
Mhm.
so it kept me grounded for the last year and a half.
Did you uncover any new insights from the work?
He's been writing and speaking about Palestine as long as I've known him and longer. I mean, when we were still dating at the University of Florida, which was only 4 months that we dated, and then we got married. But he would publish something called the Arab Gator, because the alligator is the mascot of the University of Florida. And so it had a picture of an alligator with a hot dog on their head.
Yeah.
And he did this once a month. He was the head of the Arab student club. And so, January, it was a new year and the Palestine problem. February, somehow he could connect Washington's birthdays in February. Washington and the Palestine, what would he have thought? And every single month, he was amazingly creative that way.
Mm.
And I would type these on the stencils and we'd run them off on the machines.
Yeah, wow. What happened?
And so I've been living with this for over 60 years now.
Wow.
Or 60 years, I guess. We were married for 55.
Yeah. And knowing so much about it and having decades, what do you think people today, and from your maybe conversations with other people, what do you think people today get wrong about the history of Palestine?
Oh, so much. Some people say, well, they've been fighting over there for thousands of years. Well, there has been fighting over there for thousands of years, maybe so, but not between Arabs and Jews. They just never were. And there are some Jews, there's an entire community of Jews in Jerusalem that show up at all the demonstrations, and they say they do not recognize the state of Israel. They say it's against the Oh, they said, God is supposed to provide it. We're not supposed to do this.
Mm.
And in 1492, when the Arabs were, the Castilians pushed them out of Spain, guess who went with them? Was pushed out at the same time? The Jews.
Mm.
They were pushed out together.
Interesting. Yeah. And the Jews, a lot of Jews lived in the Arab world for a very long time.
That's not a problem. Just like a lot of Christians live in the Arab world, all over. There are Christians in Gaza, Christians on the West Bank, Christians all over.
Oh.
Jesus was born in Nazareth or Bethlehem.
Yeah, I've been to his birthplace. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Perfect. But obviously that changed following the creation of Israel, where unfortunately
The Jews and the Arabs don't have a problem. It's the Zionists that are causing the problem because they want the land. And they want to exclude other people. It doesn't make sense.
Dixiane, thank you so much for sharing all that you shared. If people wanted to get the book, where can they get the book? And what would they learn mostly from the book?
I think they would learn that they'd learn more about the history of this and how all of his sources are from UN observers, and they're credible sources of the things that happened and the injustices were done. It's available from Amazon. It's going to soon be available at more of the online bookstores. I'm working on getting it up on Ingram, so it'll go to bookstores.org and other Barnes and Noble, but only online.
Perfect. Dixiane, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate this. It's been great hearing from you.
Thank you.
Thank you.